Hello, my name is Tim Nimigan, and I am an artist with the Napanee Beaver, and currently there is a show of my works that's here until December the 11th, and 40 of my favorites. And so if you're able to make an appointment to get into the museum to see it, that would be great. And so I'm going to talk to you about some of my cartoons, and particularly I'm going to talk about how the ideas come to me. A lot of people ask questions. I've been doing this for 17 years, and a lot of people have asked questions over the years. I have a list here actually of some of the others that I might delve into later, but the first one I want to deal with is how do you come up with your ideas? I have one on the screen to begin with, and the way this came about was I was supposed to have a book launch here at the museum, and that was to be in May, and of course with COVID that got canceled or postponed, and so that didn't happen. But in preparation for that, I came up with this cartoon, and actually it's against the backdrop of a bit of a display, and I think you can see my little arrow there. That display was actually in the museum at the time, and I threw enough in there to represent it, and then the small pictures down the hall represent my show. But I do have a person who proofs my books, and I've just come out with a second book. That's why we were going to have the book launch, of course. And what happened was that I have a proofer for my book, and I thought, okay, what if I didn't have somebody proof my signage at the book launch? So hence it's a book lunch, and this lady came for the food, not for the book. Over here so I can grab the arrow. So as you know, we've had a lot of news about the American election and so on, and I don't get into political cartoons, although sometimes I get awfully close. And in our house, there has been some vested interest because of my wife being an American and my two kids having dual citizenship. But anyway, this came about as a result of the amount of twittering going on. We won't mention any names, but I came up with this idea, rhymed with Twitter. Fritter, the newest social media platform, not satisfied with the amount of time you waste. I'm amazed at the amount of wasted time you've been missing. Frit your friends today and every day. So it's a bit of a comment on how much time was being spent on Twitter by somebody. Not advancing here. There we go. Sorry about that. There are several different ways that you can create humor. When I taught art at high school here in Napanee and taught a unit on cartooning, sometimes I would have kids try and come up with an idea that was funny, and it might not be, or just was maybe a bit obscene or crude or whatever. And so I thought, well, what can I do to get them to come up with an idea that has impact? And so is there something I can teach them so that they will be able to apply that to whatever their subject is? One of those things that I came up with in the list is a play on words. I had actually a lesson called What Makes Things Funny, and one is a play on words, and that's what's happening here. As you see, do you happen to have any of that gluten-free stuff? And it looks like he could stand to lose a few pounds, but glutton instead of gluten. I'm sure you caught that already. My wife says if I have to explain my jokes, then they're not that funny. I'll point out something on this cartoon, and you can kind of look for it in the other cartoons coming up, as long as you still listen to me. And that is that in every cartoon, I have a dog, and that's on his t-shirt in this case. And and that's for my one daughter, Kayla, who when I started doing the cartoons, she wanted a dog in the worst way, and I never did want a dog in the worst way. And so as a consolation to her, I said, I'll tell you what, I will include a dog in every cartoon for you. After I did that for the first one, I thought, well, my other daughter's going to feel left out, so I will do something for her. And her name is Laura, and so you can see back in which really is representing the waterfront river pub in Napanee here. I think I messed up their name, but Jane, I'm sorry. Anyway, Laura, L-A-U-R-A. So I'll let you look for those. Have I got people on Zoom that can respond if I ask them a question? I don't see any. Okay, so where do I come up with my ideas is the question that we're addressing. My son-in-law in California and my daughter down there, it was my daughter's birthday. He wanted to make sure he got her a nice cake. So he went to the grocery store where they had a bakery and deli and so on. And so he asked the person that waited on him if he could get a cake and could he write happy birthday, Kayla, or something like that on the cake. And so fellow said, oh, okay, went back. It's gone quite a while. And turns out that he came out and it was quite sloppily done. There was actually little whipped cream things on the top of the cake, and his lettering went even on top of the whipped cream, and it was quite funny. So that made for cartoon material for me, and that he actually acknowledged that he usually works in the deli, not the bakery. So sometimes I go out looking for the cartoons, sometimes they come right to me. And for the last 20 years, we have lived in a house where there's 2 empty lots beside us and a whole empty field behind us. And then more recently, those areas are going to be developed, and right beside us has been developed already. And so one of my responses to that was to change our town, which has been the moniker for my cartoons for 17 years, but changing it to our city. Dog's pretty obvious there. And Laura, I'm sure you can see, if you look long enough, up in the windows up there. Another aspect of the houses being built, but also all the houses on our street, even before the new build, it was noticeable that hardly anybody, if anybody, use their garages for a car, because the garages are so narrow these days that once you get a car in, there's no room for anything else. So that prompted this cartoon. You'll see the dog in the back seat. You'll see Laura upside down on the license plate. With both the American election, which we were following closely, and with the COVID situation, there was a lot of times when the news was just a little bit rattling, and so this was a response to that. Based on what you've told me, my own observations today, and no prior history of anxiety, I'm prescribing complete rest from all forms of news media. Not a bad idea sometimes. You'll notice the dog, of course, and on the desk, it's Dr. Laura Begora. When my daughter was really young, that was my nickname for her. When my book came out in May and we couldn't have the book launch, I enlisted the help of, if you would, Bill Walechka from CKWS TV in Kingston. I told him the situation about not being able to have a book launch, and he was all over it. He had me do an interview on Skype, I guess it was. And prior to that, he had joked that, maybe I could do a cartoon of him. Well, you don't joke with a cartoonist. Cartoonists take things seriously. So anyway, there's Bill Welechka, and of course you have to guess who the anonymous caller was. Laura and Kayla, Laura there, Laura and the dog, and hard to have a dog in the electronics section of the store, so dog and more than one on his time. COVID is one of those topics that when it comes to cartooning, you have some serious topics, which COVID is, people losing their lives. But around that serious topic, there is still opportunity to do something that is not going to be insensitive, and people can, have a lighthearted look at certain aspects of it. So this was my first COVID-related cartoon, and so of course trying to apply social distancing to the highway where people are tailgating. Dog in the window, Laura down at the bottom of the post. I hope if you're watching that you are finding these before I mention them, because then that's a legitimate guess. So lots of emphasis on wearing your mask. Of course, there are some times when that's not quite so convenient. And so I think this one speaks for itself. They all should speak for themselves. And so you see the Laura, L in the first one, A there, U there, R there, A there. So they get spread out a little bit. And the dog is harder to find in this one, but just like the tie, there's some faces on the cake that are the dog. One of the results of COVID was, at the early stages, was to have to alter the way education was delivered, and there were options. And so I came up with the idea of having a vending machine that gave you opportunity, and then would pop the registration for the type that you wanted to have your child engage in. And of course, the last button there is forget it all and wait for 2021-22 school year. Dog in her beret, and Laura up in the sign there. Well, with social distancing having to happen, this was when some places were starting to be able to open up, hair salons and so on, and so this was an idea that came. I don't think there had been any openings around that time, but memory served me well that the mayor always used a big pair of scissors for those. Dog sleeping in the basket, and I believe Laura is on its side right there. L-A-U-R-A in the hair clippings. I pity this poor officer trying to solve this crime. I saw the whole thing, officer. The culprit was wearing a hat, sunglasses, and a mask. And of course, he is, she is, everybody else in line for the bank is. You'll see the dog, pretty plain and clear. And the lady is pointing not just to the dog, but if you just keep going up her finger, you'll see upside down is Laura. I don't think having the desks 2 meters apart is going to be very good for Michael's marks this year. So I think the look at it in the teacher's face, you'll see that the teacher's probably finding out for the first time that Michael's marks were totally dependent on Laura's. How do you know it's Laura? Because her name's on her pencil case there. The dog, by the way, I can't find myself. Where did I put her? Oh, pretty obvious on her shirt. One good question to ask is, do I ever make mistakes in the cartoon? Just 1 second, I need a little drink here. Yes, I do. And I don't always find them until they've gone to print. So it's a small one, but in this one, there is a mistake. I'd like you to tell me, if you're trying to find a mistake, what that person in the back seat there, of the 3 students, what he's writing on. Looks like he's writing directly on the desk. And that's because I forgot to draw a piece of paper on his desk. I went to the dentist back in June, I believe it was. And this is what greeted me at the dentist. Our dentist is a very gentle and very personable dentist. And but that day, of course, with COVID, he was having to wear all sorts of PPE. And so I said, can I take a picture of you? Because there's got to be a cartoon here somewhere. And he laughed, and I've done cartoons actually before that involved him in different ways. And so he said, sure, and I took his picture. And then when Halloween came along, then that was obviously the time to see that I use this. And so I was going out as a weird, scary zombie vampire werewolf, but now I think I would prefer to go out as a dentist because that's scarier. One thing I like to do is sometimes include names of people other than Laura in the cartoons, and sometimes I'll do it because somebody gave me an idea. They came to me and said, I got an idea for a cartoon. And a lot of times I don't go with those ideas because sometimes it's they want to lambaste somebody. They want to get too political for what I usually do. And anyway, every now and again somebody will come up with an idea. That's not the case here. This is just totally my idea. But sometimes I slip in friends' names somewhere. So on the back wall, you'll see the Good Brusher Club list. Laura is there because I have to have Laura in. Her husband's name is Andrew, so he becomes Andy. My other daughter is Kayla, and so her name's there, and her husband's name is Tim also, so he becomes Timmy. I have a niece who is a dental hygienist, and so she has 2 kids living at home, and so I put Matt and Kira in there. I walk with Chris Seeley, and his wife's name is Rosaline, so they're in there. We had recently visited some friends, Justin and Cheryl, so I threw them in. And the editor of the Napanee Beaver, who prints my cartoons, he has a daughter named Molly. So that's who all got to be on the Good Brushers Club. The funny thing was my niece said that was the first time probably her kids were ever on the Good Brusher Club. On the eve of the American election, and this was a serious election for people in the States, and they're very divided in terms of their allegiances and thinking. And so there was the whole thing about, can you trust the mail-in ballots and the official drop box and all that kind of stuff. And so, of course, there's been all sorts of problems with claims of fraud and whatnot. So I didn't want to send my American friends a heavy cartoon or one that lambasted anybody. The focus here is on the climate that was being presented and the opportunity that these young entrepreneurs found. And so the real fraud is them getting all the leftover Halloween candy. Of course, the election was just a few days after Halloween, And so they're perpetrating the biggest fraud right there, getting all the extra Halloween candy. And let's see, the dog is obvious, and Laura, L over here, A all on the ground, U, R, and an A over here by the dolly. So I think that is the last cartoon I have here. I meant to add one in, which was in the paper yesterday, and it was an idea that was given to me by my friend who I golf with, and he's a former colleague as well. And so, as I say, I do take ideas from people. Most of them are mine by a long shot, but every now and again, somebody comes up with a good one. And in fact, my friend Bob, he's tried to feed me several ideas over the years and bemoan the fact that I never took them. So I do have a few questions here that some of you may have thought of as you were watching. How did I get started doing our town? Well, it goes back a lot of years that I took the place of a fellow who was in the art department at Napanee High School, Josh Butel, and he was the editorial cartoonist for the Napanee Beaver. And so there was probably an opportunity to start doing cartoons after he left to just fit into his spot. But I did not want, as a young teacher, to come in and then having to look for ways to point out everybody's faults or whatever, lambaste anybody. I didn't think that was a good introduction to town for me. So I laid that idea to rest. But after living here for several years, I started in 1974, and by 2003, I had amassed in my head lots of impressions of a small town living. And I had a lot of cartoon ideas go through my head during that time. So I ran into the editor of the Napanee Beaver, Mrs. Morrison, one day, and I told her that I was thinking of doing a cartoon based on small town living. And so she said, well, get some ideas on my desk. So 2 weeks later, I had some ideas on her desk. And so that was 17 years ago now, and still going. So I'm grateful to Mrs. Morrison and the editors that I've had at the Beaver for their support all these years. Some people want to know how long it takes to do each cartoon. I figured probably about around 3 hours, sometimes a little faster, maybe sometimes a little slower, but including getting the idea or formulating or improving the idea and the actual drawing of it. Have you ever had any trouble coming up with a cartoon in time for the deadline? Yes, I have. As a matter of fact, I've sometimes gone to bed at night. I have a deadline the next morning at 10 o'clock, and I still don't have an idea, but I figure, well, I'll go and sleep on it and get up early. So I get up at 5 or 6, and it's funny how many times that when I did, by the time I woke up, something had come to mind, and I would make my deadline. Do you have some favorite cartoons? Yes, I do. As a matter of fact, I mentioned earlier that there's 40 of them here at the museum, and so feel free to come. If I thought they were funny the first time, I hope I still find them funny, and so yes, there are some that I enjoy. Have you ever made any mistakes in the cartoon? I think I addressed that earlier, so pass by that one. Once you have the beginning of an idea, is it hard to make the cartoon funny? It's a bit of a process to, excuse me. Apologize for that. It's a bit of a process to take something and you know what your subject's going to be, but you need to make it funny somehow. So I used to go through a process with my students. We'd pick a topic. You know, we'd say, okay, let's make it about hockey, all right? We'd list all the ingredients of hockey, the players, the the fans, all that kind of stuff. And then we narrow it down. And I remember one time doing this, and we narrowed it down to goalie. And so we were going to focus on the goalie. So what do you do with the goalie? Well, then we came up with the idea that the goalie had an unfair advantage somehow. And so came up with the idea that the goalie had these huge illegal pads and that nothing could get by him. There was one little spot that he hadn't covered in the net. And that was the only opportunity anybody was going to get, obviously. So, is our town syndicated and showing up in other newspapers? No, it's just in the Napanee Beaver. So I've been asked if I'd like to have it syndicated. I guess that would be enjoyable, but I've never really pursued that. So have you ever had a cartoon turned down by the editor? I've had a couple, and one was just not the right time for it, and we published it later just because of what was happening at that time. And then the other, I just altered it somewhat because the editor was concerned about one area of sensitivity with a group of people. And so I altered that cartoon, and then it was resubmitted, and it worked in that form. Are the frame copies of your cartoon in this exhibit available for purchase? Yes, there are 40 frame cartoons here. And at the end of this show, December the 11th, after that, these cartoons are available for sale. And so you can contact the museum, and if you have a favorite one, they've been posting all the cartoons with a little contest on their Facebook page. And if you look up there, you'll see which ones are represented here, and you could maybe put your speak in for one. You laugh at your own cartoons like people laugh at their own jokes. I guess that was similar to the idea earlier. Do I still find my cartoons funny? And yes, some yes, some no. Do you still have fun doing the cartoons when having to work to a deadline? That's a very good question, because it's like artists who are doing commission work versus freelance art. Sometimes commissions just sort of hang over your head, and you really don't enjoy them that much. And so the deadline can do that. But I found it's been helpful over the years to have that, and just force me to zero in on what needs to be done. So I think that's most of the questions that I could anticipate somebody asking. If you have any others, feel free to contact me maybe through my Facebook page. But be sure to get into the museum and see the show. As I say, here till December 11th. My two books are also here. The first book came out in 2013 after 10 years of publishing the cartoons. And then the second book goes from 2013 to 2020. They also have copies of the book here at the museum, and they are available in some of the stores in town in Napanee here, or again, contact me through my Facebook page. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you learned something about our town in so doing. Bye now.